news about the growth of electricity demand in the United States. As being reported by Inside Climate News, electricity demand in the first 7 months of 2024 grew by 5% from the same period in the previous year. That's a really remarkable growth in demand. It's the highest percentage growth in decades. This is in line with what grid planners had been projecting, but they hadn't really been seeing it yet demonstrated because of improvements in efficiency. So, kind of a good news, bad news, which is that it's nice to know that the projections are matching reality, but also that we're kind of overcoming some of our efficiency gains. Anyways, what's going into the growth of electricity demands? Well, a few things. First, we've seen a few big demand functions coming online as the economy continues to transition into our climate future. This includes things like the increased need for power for artificial intelligence data centers and the reshoring of manufacturing and industry to the United States. In general, the returning of industry to the U.S. is a good thing, as we have more efficient power grid, and the footprint of transoceanic shipping can really cause climate emissions to jump. So there's a good news there with a bit of a note of caution that we need to keep cleaning the grid up. As for AI, there's just not a ton of good news in that yet. Most AI functions replace lower emissions alternatives, so if you can, when feasible, you might want to think about using those instead. The other thing that is driving our increased electricity demand has been an abnormally warm year. That too is in line with climate predictions, or actually slightly ahead of them. So that's just bad news as air conditioning usage increases. And that's just what's driving our increased demand. So how do we meet that new demand? Some good news and bad news here too. First, the good news. Renewable energy is growing very rapidly as more facilities are being installed. Again, comparing the first 7 months of 2024 with the previous year, we saw an 8% increase in wind farm electricity generation and a kind of staggering 30% increase in solar farm generation. That's just incredible. Across the country, we've seen very few installations of natural gas plants, none of coal, and thousands upon thousands of megawatts of solar, wind, batteries, and even a few nuclear facilities coming online. Clean energy is very much on the march. Now, the bad news. Even with that growth, clean energy only met about 45% of the increased demand. We're growing our consumption faster than clean generation capacity is growing. So the remaining 55% roughly was picked up by the mostly existing power sources working at higher capacity factors than we've seen in the recent past. That means coal power plants, gas power plants running at fuller capacity. Success is retreating from us about as fast as we're making progress. So where do we all go from here? I would expect to see this tension continue through next year. It's only getting warmer. AI and industry really aren't going away, but renewable energy will continue to be as it increases in demand. That will also demonstrate the need for additional funding. So development should continue apace. The things to look for would be whether governments expedite or remove siting and interconnection regulatory requirements and really help to accelerate even further the adoption of renewable energy. Also, small bittersweet news of this is that a warming world requires less heating. And from a climate perspective, heating is a far higher emission source than air conditioning. It's just you tend to burn things for heat. You tend to use air conditioning using electricity. So that should help us on the emissions front some too. We just haven't found a solution for climate change yet, but we're definitely getting warmer. And that is your Climate Dad joke of the week. So it's been a bit since we've talked about climate tipping points, but let's look back at one that has worried people for a long time, the melting of Arctic permafrost. If you're not familiar with what permafrost is, it's something that happens in and near the Arctic underground. I should say the underground in and near the Arctic. Most people know that if you dig down into the ground near your home, for example, a few feet down, you get to a point where the temperature becomes pretty constant. This is an effect that is captured for good use in ground source heat pumps, but more traditionally, and it was why cellars were used to store food and wine, and why many cultures live in caves or underground dwellings. It just made things more comfortable. But in the Arctic, the deep cold of winter means that digging down into the soil actually leads you to where the earth is permanently frozen, even in the summer. Because it's so cold, any water that permeates down to that level, which again is only a few feet down, freezes and makes the earth impermeable. It's a permanent frost or a permafrost. Uh, the dirt essentially becomes just a bunch of frozen mud when you get a few feet down. And this is why, if you like a look at pictures of Arctic landscapes in the summer, they're frequently dotted with lots and lots of ponds. There's just really nowhere for the water to seep down into or go away to. But the thing about permafrost is that it's more than dirt and water. Soil in lower, in temperate climates is composed of a lot of organic material, and that organic material moves lower after it has been into the soil, after it's been digested by microbes and fungi. Permanent carbon sequestration. A lot of other people are talking about how soil can be an incredible sink for carbon. But in permafrost, it's too cold for those microbes to work very well. So much of the organic material becomes buried and frozen and locked in. What ends up happening is when the permafrost melts, that buried material now is able to decompose. And due to the depth, anaerobic digestion would lead it to turn into methane. And as we all know, methane is far worse for the climate, somewhere between 20 and 85 times as bad, depending on your time scale, than carbon dioxide is. People used to worry that there would become a point where permafrost would melt and would hit a tipping point, and that it would essentially drive itself to melting the rest. It would become a feedback loop that would cause a tipping point. However, a recent paper in Nature Climate Change, published just in June, posits that this is pretty unlikely, that permafrost melting is mostly linear, which is to say, if you warm the earth some, a corresponding amount of permafrost will melt and methane will be released. So it's not great by any stretch, but also not necessarily uncontrollable. What it does mean, though, is that our efforts to deal with methane need to get better faster because the earth is warming and methane is being released from the melting permafrost. A 2021 pledge from over 100 countries to cut methane emissions is like a great starting point, but it's unfortunately just not enough. Success is retreating from us about as fast as we're making progress. Something like 60% of methane emissions come from the burning of fossil fuels, farming, and landfills. That is to say, human sources. So, as the good people at Project Drawdown point out, wasting less food, eating less meat, and driving fewer miles will help. And as we've illustrated, even an EV has a footprint. The positive side of this is you can do something about it. And the upside of that is it will save you money and make you healthier. So don't let anyone paint this as a sacrifice. It's a benefit. It's not a flaw to be more efficient. It's a feature. We're also finding that fossil fuels release a lot more methane than they're being reported. Overflights of oil fields by remote sensing has illustrated that something between 4 and 8 times the emissions that the EPA is estimating from fossil fuel extraction is actually happening. So that only puts a really fine point on that we're going to have to both reduce the consumption of oil in the long term and more immediately in the short term, reduce the emissions from its production. It's essential that we fix this. A different report published in Frontiers of Science in July found that rapid reductions in methane emissions this decade are essential to slowing warming in the near future and keeping low warming carbon budgets within reach. In any event, we're making progress. We just have to keep going. All right, a couple of things to ask you all. The first is, if you're learning from this or appreciating what you're hearing on the Climate Dad, do me a really big solid right now. Go to your podcast app and like, rate, review, share it. It costs nothing but maybe 30 seconds, and it'll help me keep growing my audience. I'd really appreciate it if you'd share it on social media. And then 2, if you're ready to be part of what reduces our risk of hitting climate tipping points or melting the permafrost, the power is in your hands. We'd love to help you over at Acclimate, where we have the easiest climate solution for your business. We'll show you ways to reduce your carbon footprint and get you on the path to net zero. You'll win new customers, keep your most valuable ones that are requiring it now. You'll attract and retain the talent you need from the climate generation. And we have a great green business certification program, which will help you to show your climate bona fides and win certification with B Corp, EcoVadis, Green Business Benchmark, CDP, the whole shooting match. Our smallest customers can even start for $10 a month. It's just about as easy as it gets. And then for our larger customers, we have the full suite of services that you need in order to get ahead and win. Now, it's time to meet with today's guest, Deb Ryan with S&P Global. She's been leading work within the oil and gas industry for methane reductions, and you're going to learn a lot about how commodities interact with fossil fuels and how some of the people we need in the climate fight aren't always who you would expect. Deb's a pistol. Deb's a pistol. She and I get lunch from time to time, and it's always fun and informative. To wrap up, I want to hear from you. Please go to acclimate.com or send an email to theclimatedad@acclimate.com to submit a question for me or the show. Again, Acclimate is spelled ACLYMATE. If your business needs help measuring, reducing, reporting, or offsetting your company's climate footprint, please reach out to my team at Acclimate, and we'll get you set up with the best and easiest climate solution out there. Thanks again to Deb Ryan for joining me, and thank you all for listening. I'll be back next time with a breakdown of all things climate and with another guest. Do make sure to subscribe to The Climate Dad where you get your podcasts and to like, share, comment on social media. I'm Mike Smith, and this was The Climate Dad.